into it. Kia ora koutou. I want to acknowledge that I am Zooming today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who've been custodians of this unceded land since time immemorial. I'd also like to pay respect to the Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, in particular the fierce matriarchs who were such central figures in decision-making and community shaping. We honour your work. Please take a moment, take a breath, ground your feet and your body, be present to and acknowledge where you are and the custodians of that place. I want to speak for just a moment about breath. The Māori word for love is aroha. Aro means to pay attention to, and ha means the breath. To love is to pay attention to the breath. As the Australian collaborators in feminist theologies started to think about ways to do events and engage differently online, as COVID meant cancelling other plans, this particular panel was in some ways my brainchild. Theological animation in the Watershed. In 2 Timothy 3:16, Paul states, all scripture is God-breathed. In Genesis, God breathed the breath of life into Adam. In John, Jesus breathed on them and said to them, receive the Holy Spirit, to his disciples. This watershed for me means the rivers that I walk by, the Maribyrnong and the Yarra, the catchments of Melbourne's drinking water, the Thompson and Marinda dams, the O'Shaughnessy, Sugarloaf and Cardinia reservoirs, this watershed moment where George Floyd and David Dungai cry out, I can't breathe. Pollution, deforestation and resource extraction in the name of economic recovery impact our air quality. There are COVID restrictions on our distancing and socialising so we don't breathe on one another. And yet, within this pause on normal, Papatuanuku, our Earth Mother, is breathing. This feels like a moment critical to pay attention to the breath, to defend and care for those and that which is most vulnerable. This is to show love. This is to pay attention to the breath of Creator and all creation. I am so grateful to be joined here today by our panelists to assist us in this paying attention. Maria Timon, Dr. Di Rayson, Thea Ormerod, John Cornford and Anne Albee. Maria, will you unmute and lead us off?
Hi everyone, can you hear me? I'd like to begin my presentation with my traditional way of welcoming everyone. Kamna benene Maori. Or a big welcome to all of us who are here today to listen and to learn from this which I call meroro in my language, or a conversation with each other. I also want to show my respect and honor to the Indigenous people of Australia, past, present, and future. Their stories, traditions, and living cultures will always be part of us despite our cultural diversities. I also want to thank the Australian collaborators in Feminist Theologies for organizing this event. Thank you. I can't see my my PowerPoint. Can you help me with that then? Thank you very much. The interconnectedness of life, climate change, and pandemics. In 2015, Pope Francis in Laudato Si underlines the fundamental connection between the environmental crisis and the current social crisis, to remind us that everything is interconnected. Next slide, please. For those of you who haven't heard Kiribati before, Kiribati is a tiny island in the Pacific. It consists of 32 coral atolls with one raised island called Barnaby, and they are very tiny. They are, some of the islands, when you stand in the middle of the island, you could actually see both sides, the lagoon and the lagoon and the other, what is the other side. So it really shows how tiny the islands are and are very vulnerable to climate change and rising sea level. I want to begin by sharing my short story. I come from a very small island nation in the Pacific called Kiribati. Kiribati people from our ancestors till now have a very deep connection with our land, which makes it very hard for us to think about relocation. My people have so much respect for the land. Land is not part of us, but land is us. And when it becomes us, it is also becoming part of our culture and our identity, that if we lose it, we also lose our sense of belonging. Our people believe that if we do not look after the earth is also not going to look after us. And as we see right now, our planet is living with yet another pandemic. And like climate change, it does not discriminate between race, culture, or gender identity. The Kiribati shores are eroding. People are losing their homes to high tides and storm surges. And yet the world leaders are denying their responsibility for the climate crisis. My people are witnessing and experiencing the impact of climate change, and it is a big challenge that our people are facing. As you can see on one of the slides, with a best of maternity ward, that was happened in 2016 during Cyclone Pam. Vanuatu and other Pacific Islanders were really affected by that cyclone. And my friend, she was a nun, unfortunately, she passed away 2 years ago with cancer. She was very young, 33 years old. But she was at this hospital when this incident happened, when the storm said the water just came in and hit the land and the hospital and flooded everywhere in the hospital. And she told me the story that because she was a nun, she was wearing, this nun's habit. Everyone in the hospital at the time ran towards her, and they were like, please pray to God to help us. And the story was very emotional, and it's really sad how people, the marginalized people who are already struggling with life, on top of that is climate change is really affecting their daily lives. Even though Kiribati is free from COVID-19, but it still has a big impact on the people, particularly women. People in Kiribati and other Pacific Islands rely heavily on food imports, and due to COVID-19 crisis, these imported foods have been reduced. Right now in Kiribati, the price of rice has risen by 50%. 50%. This also means that women are going to work harder for the survival of the family. For example, they will spend more time at the markets to sell goods and fish in order to get enough money to buy a kilo of rice. COVID-19 and climate change are making it harder for women and young girls to manage household responsibilities like cooking, gathering resources or fetching the water, and of course, caring for the children. Kiribati, like many other Pacific islands, is a Christian country. But at first, people used to believe that climate change was natural and a way that God is punishing them. They were really sad and upset when they learned that it is the result of human action. I strongly feel that it is not fair that people in Kiribati and Tuvalu and other developing countries who are hardly contributing to climate change are facing the effects of climate change while others are living in a very luxurious world. As Christians, we need to take care of the planet and each other. I really think that in order to do this, we need to have a change of heart, compassionate towards God's creation. Although Kiribati remains free of the coronavirus, it continues to be one of the most vulnerable to climate change, and people may be forced to leave their homes. Now, let's reflect on what we could do to make a difference and have a healthy and happy world. Let us work together to combat climate change by lowering our carbon footprints. I believe that to have a healthy planet, we also have a better life and future. I would like to finish off my presentation with a quote from Father Claude, a work colleague at the Edmund Rice Center. And I quote, "We are called to different relationships with nature." Just 1 second, please. With nature and the earth. We have to overcome indifference and feel the pain of others in our hearts. In the pandemic, no one is immune. We have to be in solidarity with one another, to care for each other and to all living beings, and take collective responsibility beyond our fences or the nearest hill. Thank you very much for listening and for being here. And I want to bless each of you with our Kiribati blessing. Te Maori, te Roi, te Tapumoa. Good health, peace, and prosperity upon you all. Kampesin Rapa. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for being a voice for those who are most vulnerable. It feels really important to open with that, and for that to be the place where we start, and for the context of the further conversations today. Thank you. Di Raisin, I believe we have you next.
Here I am. And hi, everybody. It's just great to be together in this sort of virtual way. I'm talking to you from beautiful Biripi country on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. So I'm on a farm. Just behind my house are the mountains, which is the place of secret men's business, and to the east is the coast, which is the home of women's business. So I feel like I'm nestled in a really beautiful and significant place, and I too honour the people that have gone before us here in this space. So some of you don't know me. I'm a lecturer at the University of Newcastle, but we don't have theology there any longer. So I teach into the humanities programs. I'm a public theologian, so I pop up in media a little bit in this part of the world, trying to make clear for people the connection between the issues that we all face in the community and the theological perspectives and wisdom that can speak into different issues. And that's actually why I became a theologian in the first place, out of a background in public health and social policy, because I just got so cross that the church just seemed to be dragged into issues of climate change rather than leading from the front. And I felt that we had some really solid theology through the whole of Christian and Judaic theologies to help us with that. So in my roles in the Anglican Church, I try and not only preach and teach other ministers about that theological tradition, but try and have some input into systemic change as well. And I think that's a theme that I try and bring into a lot of my theology, that we operate on the very personal and individual level, so that we ourselves are not complicit in what's going on, particularly around climate change, but also we act in the public political arena and push for systemic changes that will really make a difference in the world. So I'm often tussling with those two ideas. I'm a scholar of Bonhoeffer, and that's what all these books behind me are, the complete works. And I'm quite interested in how Bonhoeffer can speak into issues of eco-theology, and as an eco-feminist, I feel like there's real support there as well for engaging in these issues, because Bonhoeffer really tries to subvert the problems of the exertion of power one over another, both at the individual level and at the state level, the political arena. So there's a real foundation there for the type of eco-feminist thinking that tries to dismantle these notions of exertion of power, not only between humans and groups of humans, but also between humans and the other creatures on Earth. So when we think about things like monoculture or fish farming in Tasmania, industrial farming of domestic animals, as opposed to my little herd of 16 ladies that walk around these green fields. These are real issues of dominance and power. So as an eco-theologian, I think it's really important to try and address some of the problematic theologies that have fed into and supported this problem of dominance and power. And we've seen that historically through colonialism. And, you know, this has resulted in the issues that we've got with climate change. So I guess today I just wanted to bring into the discussion one of Bonhoeffer's teachings on how we understand the Lord's Prayer. Now he's writing in Nazi Germany and talking against issues of the Third Reich, the new kingdom that would come and exert power as a form of Christianity. But he talks about the Lord's Prayer. When we pray, "Thy kingdom come," we're actually volunteering to participate in that kingdom growing on the earth. And it's a way of bringing hope into the story, not an optimism that things will work out well, not a false optimism or a false sense of kind of a joyful, utopia, things will work, but the idea that we engage, we participate in the work of Christ, and in doing so in community, this is our source of hope. So when Bonhoeffer is talking about the Lord's Prayer, he said there's two critiques, and both of them indicate unbelief in the kingdom of God. The two ways that he talks about this are ideas of otherworldliness or looking to a future in a new earth or a new heaven, somewhere else, a future place and a future time where God will have sorted these things out. So an eschatology which removes us from responsibility on earth, this idea of otherworldliness. We don't need to engage in the problems of the earth because our hope is in an other world. On the other hand, there's problems of secularity, so which really balance, or sort of the contra to otherworldliness of having too much hope in this world, and we exert that hope by exerting power in this world, and that derives not from an eschatology, but from a problem of dominionism, of thinking that we bring God's kingdom to this earth through our powerful works, the programs and plans that we implement either through churches or through the state to bring about God's world now. And Bonhoeffer seems to think that these two sort of opposing ways of being in the world are both theological problems. So one's eschatological, this otherworldliness, but the other one is a very worldly problem of a misunderstanding of dominion. So when we think about Genesis 1:28 and the God's command to have dominion over birds, fish, and animals, somehow historically that's been misunderstood to permit some kind of domination. So not dominion, which is relational, but domination. So it becomes a power problem. So the idea of this relationality in creation, stems from our understanding of us being created in God's image, imago Dei. But God's image, of course, is relational. We understand God to be in a Trinitarian form, and a sort of an ecological reading of the Genesis stories of creation are also so relational. The idea of the man giving names to all the animals isn't for the purpose of classifying and utilizing, but it's for the purpose of being in relationship with the animals. We give names to those we know, we give names to those we recognize characteristics in. We give names to those so that we may call them. I kind of wonder if we give names so that we have a shared language, and whether there's some sort of undoing of that in the Tower of Babel story, that in the creation stories, the giving of name is also some indication that there's a shared form of communication as well. And we see these ideas of dominion, of relationality being undone through a perversion of domination and exertion of power. So you can see how that has an intersection with feminist thinking of trying to subvert those unjust power structures. So I guess the undoing of these poor theologies is a way to sort of support a different way of thinking about our engagement in climate change activities. And the other speakers are much more engaged at the front line than I am. But we do these things with a solid theology, and also with this hope in the kingdom of God that we're participating in. Yeah, so that's me.
Thank you, Di, for that fantastic overview. And I think I'm probably not the only person in the audience who has been frustrated at times by poor theology, or what might seem to be a lack of leadership from the church on what are really critical issues. But yeah, I'm so glad we are throwing to you next, because the work of the organisation you represent might be the antidote to this. Tell us the good news.
Thanks. Yes, I'm speaking from the land of the Bidjigal people of the Darug Nation in what's now known as Southwest Sydney. I'm a semi-retired social worker, a grandmother, a practicing Catholic, and president of the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, or as we call it, ARRCC. I would like to thank the Australian collaborators in Feminist Theologies for putting on this event and the opportunity to speak. Our organisation is, as you say, Talitha, a active organisation, actually based on a lot of the principles that Di has spoken about, and with people in mind like those people in Kiribati, our First Nation people who are being hit hardest by climate change and earliest. So that faith motivation is very strong, although we come from a whole lot of different faiths. We advocate for climate action at all levels, lifestyle change for individuals, sustainability for communities, divestment and care for climate risk for business, and policy change for governments. COVID has shaken up our world. It's hit the poorest and the hardest, and thrown in stark relief the fractures already present in society between those who are excluded and those who are included. People who are hardest hit are those in insecure employment, insecure housing, people not permanent residents, and women, especially those suffering domestic violence. Globally, the crisis has hit hardest those who have to either work or starve, and developing countries which have seen their export income plummet. On the upside, the changes that had appeared before to be impossible have suddenly become possible. For individuals, we've found that we don't need to consume, fly, move around as much as we did. For governments, they've found that they can find money for significant income support and investment where previously they deemed such spending as outside their budgets. And in a crisis, thankfully it's been recognised that market forces are not enough, and our nation needs strong government leadership. Following the science, Australian federal and state governments have managed the health dimensions of the COVID crisis. However, their performance on equity has been patchy, and on the climate, they've stubbornly ignored the science and continued their climate wars. Energy and Emissions Minister Angus Taylor has announced a gas-fired recovery, and the Prime Minister unilaterally appointed a COVID commission in March, dominated by gas industry executives. Its powerful influence over policy is at a time when energy policy is being set, and the federal parliament is rarely sitting, limiting scrutiny. I'm thinking here of Di's talking about domination versus relationship. There was no consultation in appointing this very important COVID commission. And so that's a critical piece of the puzzle at the moment. There's very little accountability in that commission, and it's basically phone a friend approach to not only the important response to COVID, but basically industry policy. Around Australia and the whole world, governments are spending vast amounts of money to stimulate their economies in the wake of COVID-19. The sums of money, and we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in Australia, the sums of money that will be spent over the next few months are so large that highly reputable experts like the International Energy Agency are now saying that they will determine how the whole climate crisis plays out. This is because these investments will lock in infrastructure in either fossil fuels or a sustainable alternative, depending on how the money is spent. The danger is that these decisions will lock in greenhouse gas emissions at a level not even consistent with warming below 2 degrees C, much less the currently more accepted guardrail of 1.5. It makes no sense morally or economically for governments to favour the coal and gas sectors, where less carbon intensive alternatives are readily available. ARRCC desires a world where life can flourish everywhere. For this, we need a hospitable climate, which in turn requires that high-consuming societies like Australia rapidly reduce the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. We must end the era of unrestrained extraction and exploitation of nature, and the rights of First Peoples to self-determination and to their lands should be respected. The limits of nature must be respected so that this generation hands on a world which is more or less intact for the next generation and generations to come. I'll move now to some actions that okay. Host disabled participant screen sharing. So have you got my PowerPoint?
Me.
We're asking people to take action because we're basically an action-oriented organisation. Yeah, there we are. So to the next slide. Talitha, will you move to the next slide? Okay, so we still believe it's important that individuals could reflect on how some of the pro-environmental changes that we've made could be integrated into our lifestyles long term. We were holding webinars on flying less, and it's amazing how tricky that subject was. And now look, we're basically all not flying very much. And, you know, we're managing. We're encouraging people to write to their local member and advocating for stimulus spending according to the principles of equity, economic resilience and low carbon technologies rather than a gas-fired recovery. We're saying people of faith should challenge the undemocratic way that the National COVID Coordination Commission has been set up and meet with their local member and with other people of faith and with supporters of the Australian Conservation Foundation who we're working with. And on November the 21st and 22nd, we're going to have a sound the alarm action at the time of the G20. So encouraging churches to ring their bells, rabbis to blow the shofar, Buddhists to sound the cymbals, and so on. So we have a few actions and we're working in collaboration with the Australian Conservation Foundation. Talitha, do you want to move to the next slide? So one of the key things, it's hard to know sometimes where we need to really intervene. Is it in the corruption of government, which allows mining companies to have a lot of power in Australia? It also allows other big businesses to have a lot of power. This has to do with regulation and laws which can be implemented. But right now we have a problem of a gas-dominated COVID commission. So we need to broaden the representation on the commission. There's a number of independent MPs working on this, challenging the government, to include leaders from education, from the renewable energy sector, from welfare, from Aboriginal communities, the arts. You know, why did we have leaders? There are, you know, strong, wise leaders in those sectors as well. Why gas and mining? We need an oversight, some kind of oversight committee to strictly apply accountability measures to ensure transparency. For example, a conflict of interest disclosure register. At the moment, they're just saying, yes, we're aware of the need to step back if there's a conflict of interest. That's not enough. We need actual disclosure. We need it to be in the public domain. Australia's been described as the most secretive democracy in the world. This is not conducive to transparency or to accountability or to democracy. We're calling on the government to create consultation mechanisms so people can have input into the outcomes of what the government actually implements and doesn't just rely on this very skewed commission. And we need the Commission to have guiding principles such as investment will be in sustainable technologies, that it will lead to both the lowering of emissions and the creation of the largest number of jobs, and that the benefits of the investment will help make society more equitable. This Commission, as I'm implying, is extremely powerful. And without government sitting and without there being the usual checks and balances, it's really quite scary. Could you move to the next slide? We're encouraging people to write to their local member because low carbon technologies and the low carbon sector actually employs more people. I mean, the idea of stimulus spending is basically to create jobs. That is exactly the outcome. And the thing is that gas and even coal do not employ a lot of people. They say they do, and they cite jobs as the main reason why projects need to go ahead. But the question is how many jobs? You know, service industries, education, renewable technologies employ many more people for the same amount of investment. All these details are on our website. So you go to www.arrcc.org.au, and this is detailed in great detail. We need to invest in low carbon technologies because reducing investment in mining would be fairer to First Nations people. You know, routinely mining companies are basically taking away what few land rights First Nations peoples have. Mining threatens water resources for people, farmlands and nature. Concentrating on low carbon technologies will lead to better health outcomes because of reduced pollution. And low carbon solutions are deployment ready. They're highly developed. We just need the regulatory arrangements and policy from government to give confidence to investors to invest in these deployment ready solutions. And they will create a more resilient economy, both short term and long term. And that's talking about climate risk. We're seeing a lot of companies and super funds, funds managers moving away from investment in coal. Gas and coal are going to end up being stranded assets, and they don't create that many jobs. They don't create a resilient economy. And of course, it would be fairer to young people because young people today are very often in the insecure jobs. They're the ones who are constraining their lifestyle, their education, in order to make sure that people are safe during this COVID pandemic. And long term, they're going to be paying off the debts that we incur today because of the stimulus spending that we're undertaking. So yeah, that's the end of those slides. Thank you, Talitha. So there are all the reasons that we can put to our local member. There's a sample letter. There's a couple of places on our website where there's a sample letter. But do please, whoever does write to your local member, the ideal is to write exactly in your own words. these things. We need backbench MPs to, particularly moderates, to speak out and speak up. So far, the very loud people like Craig Kelly get heard a lot, and they're pushing the debate in all the wrong directions. But if we can give some courage to our MPs who actually quietly agree with these views, if they know their constituents will back them, or that they're speaking for their constituents, then they're far more likely to speak out and support the case for sanity, basically. So I do encourage people to look at our website, look at our sample letters, write to your member. The ideal apparently is to write in your own handwriting. Those kind of letters, governments, MPs will take notice of. The ones they take least notice of is ones that are just churned out. They get 100 template letters that are exactly the same. They basically see that as just one person writing. They don't attribute. So write in your own words. Go to visit your local member. Act as an active citizen. Don't just think about it. Do it. So yeah, that's what I'm encouraging people to do. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Thea, for your call to advocacy. That paper that you're mentioning, ARRCC's position paper on recovery from COVID, is a really good read. We're definitely going to be sharing a link to that in our event space on Facebook after this, so that people can easily find it and read that. John, we are turning next to you. You have education, higher education in theology and economics, and just I've gone to Bible studies you've run, just the strong biblical principles of economy that we are or should be called to. Maybe they're not being preached on often enough. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thanks, Talitha, and thanks for having me here. And I'm seeing how you've cunningly curated this session to start with Maria's talk, to begin from the front line of where climate effects are really being felt dramatically already and have been for a while, to Di's opening up the real theological questions and challenges we have to engage. And then Thea's opening up with the big landscape of the political and policy and economic restructuring questions we face. So I'm going to be coming down into a fine grain of really Christian practice at a time like this. What climate change means requires of all people of faith, and I'm speaking particularly to Christians, people who see themselves as followers of Jesus. I'm just going to tell you a bit about the organisation I run called Manigum, and then how that speaks about climate change. So Manigum, I'll explain the name to you first. Manigum takes its name from the Eucalyptus viminalis, which is a common eucalypt in southeastern Australia, particularly along the coastal fringe, well known. And it is, when we began Manigum, we lived in Melbourne, which is the land of the Wurundjeri, as Talitha has said already. I'm speaking to you now from Dja Dja Wurrung land, actually in Bendigo, so still within the same language family, the language family of the Kulin peoples, but and a different people's land. But when we began in Wurundjeri land, and I think the proper pronunciation of that should be Wurundjeri, and the Wurrun in that word is the Woiwurrung word for the Eucalyptus viminalis. It's there. So core to the identity of that people was what we call the Manigum tree. And in fact, the Manigum leaves were used in the Welcome to Country ceremony of Wurundjeri people. So the Wurrun, the Manigum, was a tree that was a crucial part of the symbolic and cultural system of the Wurundjeri people. And that cultural system was at one and the same time an economic way of life. And that economic way of life was at one and the same time a way of living within an ecology. So all those things go together: culture, economy, and ecology. When Europeans came and they came across the tree that was known as the waran, they named it the manna gum because it produces a sweet white gum at certain times of the year, which reminded them of the biblical stories of the manna in the wilderness. And the manna in the wilderness is one of the core or foundational stories of what I would call biblical economics. And it's a story, I won't go through the details, but he essentially paints the foundation of, in opposition to an economy of not enough, where some people are poor, but also in opposition to an economy of too much, where there's overconsumption, and it sets the foundation of an economy of enough, which is, I take it as the way the Bible as a whole thinks about economics. So manna gum is a funny little thing. It's a Christian ministry that my wife and I, Kim, set up 11 years ago. Kim's just sitting next to me, working next door. She's working in grasslands regeneration, at native grasslands regeneration and broader ecological regeneration at the moment. She's patiently putting up with me talking while I'm in the room. So manna gum's concern is really to speak to Christians to reclaim what I would call a biblical perspective of the material world and material life, and a Christian practice of material life. And so, or to put that another way, its core concerns is to say what the Christian faith has to say about ecology and economics. And those two words, ecology and economics, both have the same Greek root, which is the Greek word oikos. They're both household words. So ecology refers to the great household of nature that is made up by a whole web of interdynamic and interconnected relationships. You can't understand anything within an ecological system. You can't understand what it does and how it is without understanding its relationship to the rest of the system. And economics is the study of the management of oikonomia, the affairs of the household, how we essentially deal with, think about production, consumption, and distribution within our own households, but that word's been extrapolated to think about large human economic systems. Now, we've generally thought about economics and ecology as two separate households, often in competition or tension with each other. But the reality is that the human economy is entirely embedded within and entirely dependent upon, to this day, and always will be, on the great household of nature, that is ecology. So one house is, so our house, little human house, sits within a much bigger house upon which we depend. And another core, I guess, a core part of the question for manna gum is then to think about, well, what about that other household that we have a concern for, the household of God, the church? How does that fit into these households? So it's something that is a community of faith that exists again within the broader human community, and it's something we might like to think, and I would argue for, needs to have a distinctive place in the human community, but we can never think about it as separate. So the household of God itself sits entirely embedded within and with a much larger human economy. And then finally, there's another household we're interested to take concern for, which is our own homes. and how our particular homes, the household economies that we operate, relate to all those other households that we occupy. The household of faith, the household of the human economy, and the great household of nature, ecology. And it's the understanding our understanding, and I guess the core message of our ministry is that the Bible and Christian theology provides an incredibly robust way of thinking about all of those households through a single coherent lens that allows us to integrate them and act within them in ways that are consistent and not in tension, and that are good for us in multiple ways, in the way that we think about goodness. So in thinking about climate change, what have we had to say about climate change? I guess the key concerns, there have been a few core concerns. The first one has been simply, as Di has already been pointing to reclaim the Bible as something that I think gives us a very robust framework for understanding anthropogenic climate change. It provides us actually a very good causal explanation of seeing what has happened and why, and seeing into it, not just seeing that it has happened, but seeing why it has happened, as well as providing a framework for hopeful action within that. And like you, Di, I also see the need for a clear distinction between hope and hopeful action and simple optimism, which I think can be actually counterproductive sometimes to hopeful action, to hope. So the first framework has to be to reclaim what the Bible has to how it helps us understand that what I would call the moral ecology of the Bible, how the human economy interacts with the ecological world, and what God has called us to live with, the ways in which God has called us to live within this household. And so the simple argument, which we could fill out at great length, as much time as we had to discuss, is that what we see happening when the human economy becomes driven by domination and greed, and by violence, and by our own sense of the power of our own technique, our technology, that it becomes unhealthily out of kilter with actually the real conditions placed upon us by the household that we live in, which is the planet, and things start to go awry. And so the Bible doesn't see in any way strange this last summer's catastrophic bushfires that we've experienced as a result of human action, but is the sort of thing that it said will always happen when the human economy gets completely out of kilter with the conditions of health. So that's the first thing we'd like to say about climate change. The second, a key thing is to make sure that we don't think or talk about climate change in a siloed way, and I think most of the speakers here have been good at attaching it to bigger issues. In particular, just to see climate change as a carbon problem, and so one of the dangers is to see so the problem is just carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore some people who want action on climate change, but it can lead them just to think about, for example, energy. We simply need to replace our forms of carbon emission in energy, and that's all. So I'm keen to see climate change as one part of what is really a multi-dimensional planetary ecological crisis, which has all sorts of different ways, sorts of different forms. Particularly, we're seeing it in habitat destruction is perhaps even more urgent than climate change at the moment. The rate of habitat destruction, the rate of pollution, all sorts of different pollution, species extinction, and so forth. So we need to see climate change keep it within a larger picture. And then a final key message that we've been keen to talk about is then what does that mean for us? And so when I say us, Manigama's audience is really talking to people in Australia, the majority of whom, well, if we live in Australia, we pretty much exist within the global top 15 to 20% of wealth holders, and we consume the vast bulk of the world's resources. And to ask what living in hope of a more stable world and bringing the human economy within ecological bounds might look like, what that means for us, and also not just arguing from the position of responsibility, actually what would be good for us to do in terms of good for our own wellness as well. And I guess the end game of what we're arguing for is that at a household level, we need to be choosing for a lower material standard of life than what most Australians are aspiring to as the norm. That simply, not only is it not possible for the planet to sustain that way of life anymore, but actually in all sorts of other multiple ways, in social, human and spiritual terms, it's turning out to not be very good for us either. And we need to find a way of making a positive choice for a different mode of living, which allows us to live well, and I would argue better, with less. And there's all sorts of things we could say about. And a big part of that is around reclaiming the household as a place of work, and reclaiming the household as a place of challenge economics, essentially, where we think about the household as the basis from which we interact with both the human economy and with ecology, and that it's a creative challenge of it for us to actually think about our households as mini ecologies, if you like. And I guess there's lots that could be said about that, but I'll maybe finish up there, Talitha.
Thank you so much, John. I've always appreciated the power of one person personally, and then one household, and then one community, understanding the impact. And to be honest, I really love the idea of those being houses. When you think about arguing about who's doing more of the housework, and you take all those different definitions of houses, I think that's a good challenge and a good conversation to be having. And Elvie, we have you bringing the eco-feminist theological lens. I don't know if you're going to talk about households, but I'm looking forward to how this conversation is going to go. Thank you. You unmuted there?
Okay, muted again. I think you must have muted, you must have hit the button at the same time. Okay, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think we might just need a moment to stand up and take a breath wherever we are, if you feel like it, and then we'll sit down again or whatever, and I'll say something. Okay. Okay, because there was a lot in all of those presentations. Okay, I'm joining you today from Boonwurrung country in Seaford, Victoria, and honour the elders past, present and emerging, recognising their care for these lands, waters and skies, and that their sovereignty has never been ceded. Thank you to all the speakers and to Talitha for asking me to join you today. What I'm going to do is to just say a few things about where I see ecological feminist theology today and the challenge that we face in our work as scholars and activists, and I include farmers, writers and pastors, ordained and otherwise, in these groups. But I want to begin by saying that while I respect the faithfulness and commitments of the speakers and of theology and faith, that theology and faith-based activism are uneasy spaces for many who've been serially disenfranchised in their faith traditions. And that's particularly so in the wake of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. So I think really we're talking in a corner of the public space in Australia. Okay. So probably just going to give a little bit of background to ecological feminist theology and a couple of points that are important to me at the moment. And then I've scribbled notes all around my page, so it's a bit like a midrash now or something as people spoke. So I'll try and just bring those in or speak to them at the end. So I'm not sure how much people know about ecological feminist theology. So just very briefly, ecological feminist theology has developed from the multiple forms of ecological feminism that emerged by the 1970s in two key forms, grounding theory and grassroots activism. So there was cultural or spiritual and social or socialist ecofeminism. And both forms recognised a critical relationship between women and the wider Earth community. Cultural ecological feminisms affirmed and celebrated an affinity between Earth and women, for example, in goddess spiritualities. And there is danger in those forms that celebration and affinity also perpetuated a patriarchal identification of women with nature, which has devalued both. Social ecology identified the economic, political, cultural and social factors linking destruction of Earth and oppression of women. Both streams of ecological feminism understand that the shared trauma of women and Earth is a symptom of a patriarchal order or disorder, more precisely what Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza describes as kyriarchy. And so language like lordship and kingdom, I think, are problematic in that respect and perhaps need to be rethought. Challenged to recognise the white liberal bias of some second wave feminisms, ecological feminism developed in dialogue with environmental justice approaches, and much of what people have been speaking about today have been environmental justice approaches, particularly what Thea, the basis of the activism that ARRCC is doing. And these include recognition of First Nations, a complex interweaving of social justice, ecological wholeness, and anti-racism. There is more to learn for many of us, especially in relation to the centrality of community and extended family kinship as a basis for ecological action and accountability, at the sort of basis that I think is central to the experience that Maria was talking about in Kiribati. Contemporary ecological feminism is multidimensional. I take that word from Elaine Wainwright. Recognise that gender, race, class, location and species are intersecting factors in the exercise and experience of oppression. Violence carried out against Earth and its biodiversity is a primary prompt for ecological feminist theology. Just as feminists interrogate violence against women, ecological feminist work shows that this violence intersects with other creatures and Earth itself. In this sense, ecological feminism recognises that women experience not only gender-based violence, but also violence on the basis of race, sexual identity, age, class, and location, so that their experience of violence is multidimensional: physical, structural, cultural, epistemic, psychological, ecological, and time violence, especially in relation to climate change, which impacts both ancestral land and sea and future generations, as Thea pointed out. An ecological feminist hermeneutic shows, for example, if we're looking at biblical texts, that the violent decreation of earth in the flood and biblical sacrifices are examples of violence against earth embedded in the relationship between land, law, people, and the divine in those texts. These issues intersect and interact with violence against women, the land, and animals. In counterpoint, the ecological thinking in which a contemporary ecological feminist theology can be situated offers a focus on habitat as epistemic location, as a place to know. And I'll come back to Jonathan's talk about households a bit later. So Elaine Wainwright does quite a lot of work on habitat in her work for reading biblical texts. As ecofeminist theologian Rosemary Radford Ruth argues, a trajectory of Western Christian theology has inscribed matter and body subjugating oppressions in the flesh of women and the oikos of earth. She argues that one element necessary for the development of an ecological culture and society is an overcoming of competitive alienation and domination for a compassionate solidarity. And Maria spoke about a change of heart, a metanoia toward compassion. So grounding compassion as a key to an ecological conversion, or a key element of that. This continent and the local Pacific region comprise many Indigenous nations. How compassionate ecological feminist solidarity is enacted, both in scholarship and activism, such as we've been hearing about this lunchtime, is an ongoing challenge to listen to Indigenous scholars, activists, and communities, and to be open to Indigenous-led collaborations. As Tony Birch argues, racist stereotyping of Indigenous peoples, colonial dispossession, and climate change are linked, especially through the violent legitimation of mining on Indigenous country. Writing of the emerging field of peace ecology, a number of scholars, including Ursula Oswood-Spring, Hans-Gunther Bauck, and Keith G. Tidbold, comment that the ecology concept itself was developed by scientists from different disciplines and world regions, based in part upon observation of Indigenous cultures in the Americas, China, India, and the Middle East, where knowledge on the use and dangers of plants and animals were crucial for human survival and cultural development. Members of the Earth Bible team, founded in Adelaide, acknowledged their learning from, as well as collaboration with, the first peoples of what is now Australia, as do many scholars in the environmental humanities more generally. The Earth Bible team and the later ecological hermeneutics group also acknowledged their debt to feminist scholarship. The indebtedness of ecological thought to First Nations epistemologies underscores the necessity for ecological feminist theology to be founded in respect for Indigenous knowledges and not in an appropriative way, and to ask on what authority such knowledges are employed by non-Indigenous researchers and activists. When scholars and activists seek to bring together concepts and practices of ecological sustainability, peace and justice, and feminist theological analyses and visions, we need to engage afresh with Indigenous sovereignties and as an essential beginning point of our work. So I think we're actually at a turning point in Australia, and some of that came out in the talks, particularly what Thea was saying, and I think a number of you, about what's happened during COVID-19, that we have actually had a moment. I think we might have almost passed it, but there was a moment back a couple of months ago when people understood that we could live with less and that there might be a different way forward. And the Greens are still trying to, with other groups, to put forward a new way of thinking about where we go from here, economically, socially, together, collectively. But I almost feel we've missed the that we have to really keep claiming that moment, that there's a strong push to going back to business as usual in terms of using up the planet. So anyway, just some things I really did want to highlight. So we'll go back and I'll find the little bits I wanted to highlight. So Maria said that if we don't look after Earth, Earth will not look after us. And she showed, and I think that's pointing to the kind of interconnectedness we've seen with COVID, but that we also see in, that I think it's taught us about interconnectedness, this virus, in a way that we weren't, more generally we weren't able to hear in terms of environmental damage. Whether we can help make that link more in terms of the kind of public theology that Di was talking about is a question, but that somehow viscerally people know, most of us know now, viscerally, that we are interconnected. I think the bushfires were part of that and the smoke coming into the cities, but then COVID on top of it has really pushed us in that direction to know viscerally our interconnectedness. Now, if you look at the picture that Maria showed of that Besio maternity ward being inundated by the waters of Cyclone Pam in 2016, that is another, I think Maria mentioned how her feeling as she heard the stories around that. And I think that is another visceral sort of moment of feeling that interconnectedness. And I'm sure Thea has felt that on the front lines up in the Galilee Basin, that it's, you know, it's your body that's on the line when you're there, facing, you know, arrest and standing there between the bulldozers and the fence and whatever that, you know, it is. So I think capturing some of those moments is important. So another thing I liked, almost the nested dolls thing of Jonathan's households. I think that picks up on the habitat and the oikos themes that I was just pointing to. I wrote down a lot about yours, but I want to hand over to let other people speak. Thea, I really liked what you said, the term you said, a hospitable climate, and also pointing to debt, because there's a lot of biblical material on debt, especially in the Gospels. So I think that the question of debt, one thing that we haven't talked about, I think Jonathan talked about that the bigger picture that's not just about climate change. And another element of that picture is the continuing nuclear weaponry and defence spending. And I think ICANN offers a really interesting model of activism, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. So it's just worth, if you just Google ICANN and see what their model is. I mean, I'm sure Thea's well aware of it, but I mean, just for the rest of us, that a model that has worked, that came out of the medical profession. Medical Association for the Prevention of War was one of the key actors in setting up ICANN. And so, yeah, just thought I'd throw that one in. Two other things I thought, well, three, okay. One is just that I think in COVID time, the concept of the common good has come to the fore again, especially if you listen not so much to Scott Morrison, but Dan Andrews on his better days. The concept of the common good is there in the speech, and from the chief medical officers of different varieties. And it's something that was there in Laudato Si with climate as a common good. So I think somehow tapping into that is going to be useful, perhaps. And another group that have been marginalised in this time have been arts workers, and I think the use of art and literature in activism is really important. And I was wondering, Thea, when you talked about the commission, whether we should have a people's commission that would do what we think, like whether something like a people's commission in
Is that a question?
I'm just throwing it out there for that. So, okay, look, I think I've said enough. I had a few more notes. One thing I thought we need to get behind, we now have a number of Indigenous parliamentarians. I know that Lydia Thorpe, who holds a whole lot of these issues together, will be coming into the Senate and plans to work cross party lines to bring treaty to the fore. But for her, it will be treaty with all these things in mind. So I think, you know, there are small signs of hope in terms of what's possible. But I also wonder if there's also, we're on the cusp of whether we're thinking about working within capitalism, or whether there is some sort of, whether there's more of a revolutionary impulse that it won't be from the middle class baby boomer white fellas. But we might want to think about where we stand if that happens globally. So, okay. Thanks, Talitha.
Thank you. And there has just been so much to think about, and I appreciate the call to the common good. I think one of the barriers to the idea of responding to climate change was everyone's idea that, or sense that it was too big. It's too big to tackle the idea of climate change, and what can I do when I feel helpless? And I think, this is like an awful silver lining of COVID, I think, is that we are seeing people work for the common good and for common outcomes, and for just humanity basically is working as one together because we face a common challenge. Climate change is a common challenge that we are all facing, and I think recognising that connection and recognising the ways that we're working together might, for COVID, might also be able to be converted to ways that we can respond on climate change. Small glimmers of hope indeed. Kath McKinney, I believe that you had a question. I wonder if you want to kick us off actually, and people just can come and go as they need or feel in this space.
Sure, I'm really happy to do that. I've probably got multiple questions. Thank you for everybody. But I was very piqued when Anne began and acknowledged the pain and the impossibility people find themselves in terms of staying present in communities of faith, that our synagogues, our mosques, our churches, our leaders, for some people it's just an unbearable place to be. And so the question about how we can manage a theological inquiry in that context really resonated with me. And so my question really is to all the panelists. So I nod to Anne, but I ask it to everybody. I wonder what it would be for us to consider the earth asking the same question, how the earth can trust us. when we as human beings, as persons, have proved to be untrustworthy, and what it means in relation to Maria's comment, to respond to the reality that we have not looked after the earth. So thinking of earth as person we are out of good relationship with. A little esoteric, but let's go for it.
Could I say something on that? I remember when I was young, look, my dad always told us, the children, and not just us, but I know that it's also the people around us. But my dad used to say that, you know, treat the environment, everything around you as a person. Mm. And that, let's say, if the people are going to use some part of the tree or anything, they just don't go and grab it. They used to stand and sort of pray, and not pray, but conversate with the environment, conversation with the environment, and ask permission for the environment, you know, because we needed to use it for a canoe or for a house. So we always ask permission to the environment before we use it. And I think that's a beautiful way to respect the environment. I remember my husband was born and grew up in the capital city. I was born and grew up in the very remote and almost in the bush. So when my husband came to my island to see my dad, to the family, my dad said to him, because, you know, for those of you who have been to a very remote island, some of the islands don't have proper toilets, right? So my dad took aside my husband and he said, look, this is how we live, and the environment, everything around us we must respect it, is part of us. And remember, if you go to the bush and use the bush for any business that you want to do, remember to talk to the environment and tell them that, you know, just show some of respect. And my husband was so touched by that, because he had never heard that before. But I think, I personally think myself that if we take more serious to look at the environment and treat the environment as people, then we will have the same respect to the environment as we would respect other people. And I really love what, I think it was Anne said it, I really love what she said with the prayer of our Father, thy kingdom come. I've never thought of that in that way, of that prayer in that way, you know, to be volunteered and to participate in God's creation. I think we need to teach more people on this, like me and other people around the world, that we need to, when we pray this Our Father, because sometimes we just take it for granted and we just say the prayer. I think we really need to concentrate and reflect on this prayer. And with that word, thy kingdom come, that we need to know that, you know, we are volunteering to take care of God's creation, which is human beings, humanity, and the environment. Thank you.
That was Di who said it.
Okay, that's what. Thank you. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I just want to attribute it correctly. Yeah.
Could I say something to that question too?
Please.
Just collectively, it's true that we haven't treated the earth very well, obviously, but it would be good to just have a more differentiated view. There are actually really seriously bad players, and would be wise for us to, I think, acknowledge that we're all complicit at some level, but there are definitely people who perpetrate injustice, who are completely, who are driven by greed and profit, and they are actually more damaging, and they're the ones who we who take, people in decision-making responsibilities, who have power, who have influence. And I guess that's why we're activists, because we want to be part of a human groundswell that resists evil in the world, and we can be redemptive agents in the world.
And can I jump in? Yeah. I think too, it's great to hear. I think too, Maria also pointed out that the contributions to climate change are really uneven. So that Kiribati and other places are suffering for things they haven't really done. So that's been done. Particularly, I think Thea's point's really important, that it's often a small group. But I think Di mentioned the word complicit, and for a lot of us, our lifestyles are, not just our lifestyles, but just our embeddedness in the system makes us complicit, even when we try our best not to be. So, but it's not going to be pure, our activism. We do our best, yeah.
Can we throw now to Barbara? I think you had a question too.
Yes, I don't think it needs any discussion, but it was just struck me when I was listening to Thea talk about activism and talking about the composition of the NCCC, that one of the most obvious problems with it too is that it doesn't have enough female perspective in it. So not only do we need to make sure that it's not just dominated by mining interests, but we also need to make sure that in the post-COVID recovery phase, we're actually thinking about what's happened to women and their work and their lives during this time. And without strong representation from women, we won't get that.
Thank you. I was thinking about time violence as you were talking, and I think, I hope I'm correct in quoting that, I think Indigenous belief looks 6 generations ahead at how will this impact generations from now, the choice that I make. So sometimes I think people working with Indigenous communities can think, oh, they're slow, or they're not making decisions fast enough. I think that they consider ramifications far beyond sometimes what other decision-making agencies might be thinking of. I'm from New Zealand, and they've given some mountains their personhood entity so that they can sue if what you're doing is detrimental to the health of the mountain. I think that's an extraordinary step for New Zealand to take, and I think it might even be beyond the mountain now. There might be a lake or something as well that can advocate in court for its identity and its well-being and its protection. Are there any final kind of radical ideas? I guess this is my question to the panel, things that we could be doing that might be, that we haven't thought of yet.
I just wanted to remind us that, this is a particular moment in history with the pandemic. And there is, despite the estrangement from the church for legitimate reasons, there's a real move toward the transcendent and the mystery. And there's a turn toward ritual and returning to the safety of spiritual practices. And so in my mind, that's an absolute opportunity to bring together the pandemic with with climate change and theologically and earthly Christianity. It's a time for returning to what's attractive about paganism and about primal religions and living ecologically. All those things are not foreign to our established religions. You know, the roots of them are there, and it's an opportunity for us to respond to this desire for some mysterious way of being in the world through our institutions or our organizations or our practices of being religious. So I'm quite optimistic about the opportunity that it can provide for us to respond to people's desire to be religious.
Talitha, I'll just go back to your question about the personhood of I think there's a river too. I think, and it was my understanding it was Maori people who pushed for that. So, I mean, imagine if here the Murray-Darling Basin had person status in the law, and that was mediated through the traditional owners. So I mean, I'm just saying. So, but I do think we're at a moment where we need to step back and get out of the way in Australia. The white fellas, the settler colonial invaders need to step back and get out of the way and trust that Indigenous people can make good environmental decisions at the kind of level of law and input into law and society that is necessary. It doesn't mean that we don't do anything, but that we make that a priority. That's just where I think we are. And part of that would be great if something like that happened in our law. Yeah.
I just want to say something. I've attended quite a few of probably 6 to 7 UNFCCC on climate change, and honestly, I just sort of feel that there's really no point to go and attend those meetings, you know, because it's like talking to a brick wall, like especially to the leaders from rich, wealthy countries, and I think it's about time to work with the grassroots people. I think that's where we're gonna, you know, make a big difference, because I just feel that I'm sorry, but I just feel that there's really no point to talk to those people. And the sad thing is, even though they know that this is an issue, it's about humanity, it's about the people, it's not, you know, but it seems that, you know, money and economy is their first priority, not human beings. And look, I really thank each one of you, because it's from you that you will be help us to voice out our voice, because we are very tiny. We're so, you know, very poor in materialism, and we need people to be our voice to your leaders. And I really thank you for this opportunity. Unfortunately, I have to run off because I have to travel to Goulburn, but I really thank each one of you for giving me this opportunity to share how my people, all my parents, my families are there. My son is there as well, because back in Kiribati, because I want him to learn the culture before he moves to Australia. But thank you so much. I really appreciate your this time, and one of my asks is please continue to do the great work you are doing, not just for you, but for us and for the whole world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. I will jump into saying, yeah, thanks so much to you and to all of our panelists. I know you're all muted, so I don't know if we want to do signing applause here for Maria Simon, Dr. Diarase, and Thea Ormerod, John Comfort, and Anne Elby. We're just so grateful for the ways that you show and share this love, this aroha, that you are paying attention to the breath of Creator and all creation. It is a verb, it's a conscious choice that we need to keep making, not a moment, not just a moment, a watershed moment, but a movement. And I am looking forward to the ways that we can come alongside that. We are going to post some links to web pages, blogs, events, other ways to connect with you and the work that you do that informs and inspires us. Thank you so much, all of you. We really appreciate it.